All right, I have a lot of slides here, so I'm going to go kind of fast, and um, you can always stop and replay things. We're going to really talk about how evolution occurs, a little bit more about the history of the idea. I'll describe some examples of evolution in populations. I'll talk about gene pools and genetic change over time. And so here I got a picture of uh, two wolverines. They have a really small population size, so they're experiencing genetic effects. And then two Amish people below, also small gene pool, so fast evolutionary change, fast genetic change. All right, so the basic concepts. Evolution is genetic change in a population of organisms. This change progresses from simple to complex, a historical process. This is how we think we wound up with the diversity of life. The main mechanism is differential reproduction of genotypes caused by factors in the environment that lead to genetic change or evolution. Last time I talked about the evidence, and there's lots of evidence. This is how we choose the best ideas in science. Among the most important evidence in determining the theory was artificial selection producing genetic change in animals that people bred. Also, at the same time, there was lots of evidence from fossil records that there had been change and that the existing diversity of life was only a small fraction of what had previously existed. We've also talked about things like vestigial structures and imperfect structures and looking at structures in living organisms that they got by common descent. Then the distribution of plants and animals worldwide is called biogeography. Today I'm going to go over natural experiments, and I mentioned molecular records. All right, I also posted a link on the Clergy Letter Project. There are different ways of knowing about the world. Those different ways of knowing have different starting points, different methods, and different goals and different applications. Okay, when we take those different ways and we try and compare them, that's sometimes we can get lost in the details. Um, there can be misconceptions and paradoxes that arise from these different methods. Okay, a little bit about Darwin. Darwin actually did much of his work in the 1830s before Wallace. He was a naturalist on a ship of exploration, the Beagle, that circumnavigated the world. He visited very many places, mainland South Africa, but also the Galapagos Islands. He took thousands of specimens back to England with him and began to describe and study them when he returned. He was also affected by reading about populations and mathematics, and he made several distinct postulates that helped him. One is that organisms resemble their parents, like begets like, that there was lots of variation between individuals, and some of it could be inherited. From his reading on populations, he recognized that more offspring are produced each generation than can survive. And some individuals, because of their traits, physical or behavioral, have a greater chance of survival. And so thus things may change over time. This strongly resembles what people had been observing in agriculture. Artificial selection produced rapid change over time in domestic animals and plants. Everywhere it was applied, it worked. Okay, it produced many, many new breeds of dog that were vastly different from each other in behavior, in appearance, in all sorts of characteristics. It worked in plants like corn and wheat. It worked in other animals like cattle. Perhaps one of the most convincing uh, pieces of evidence for Darwin was a natural experiment that occurred in England. This is the peppered moth, and I don't know if you look at the photo on the upper left there, there are two of them. The natural, well-known peppered moth was light-colored and well adapted for landing on the bark of trees like aspen and birch. Okay, England at the time was heavily polluted. Okay, and the trees no longer, even light bark trees, looked dark. Okay, and so very as this happened, the light-colored peppered moth began to disappear. And varieties that were relatively rare, like the dark colored moth in the photo, suddenly became much more common because the uh, this color form was inheritable, and the light colored moths were now very easily recognized by birds. And so their abundance decreased dramatically over time. Okay, and so this led to differential success, and the appearance of the moths dramatically changed. So this was a really good example of uh, evolution in action, the peppered moth, and this was called industrial melanism. Once the pollution ceased and they stopped burning coal without any kind of pollution controls, the color of the trees returned back to normal, and so did the moth populations. The selection favored the light colored moths again. Okay. We also see similar things with drug and pesticide resistance. And so we see this kind of thing going on all the time. Okay, so evolution occurs within populations. Populations are groups of organisms that interact and interbreed and share genes. Populations change in size. We know this all the time. Okay, and this is the population of lions, and you can see the changes in the size of the population. But something we didn't really recognize until recently was that the genetics changed, that the genetics of populations can change just as dramatically as the size of the population. And so this shows the changes in size and population over time, but we can also see changes um, in the genetics. And so I have a couple concepts to introduce. One is that there is something called fitness. It's the ability of an individual to contribute to the succeeding generations. Um, Natural selection favors individuals who are more fit. Those individuals will leave more offspring. And so the next generation will resemble those fitter individuals more than the average individual. This is an important idea. Um, the genes of those fitter individuals will become more and more common. Okay. What this requires for populations is lots of variation. And variation includes visible traits like color, shape, size, and behavior. In domestic animals, we can often see this, but it also includes things that are harder to see, things like enzyme variants that really produce no change in the appearance or behavior, but may make the dog faster or stronger or something like that. Um, so there's an equation to represent this. This is called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And this shows p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals p plus q squared. And this is shows the allele frequencies in a population that is at genetic equilibrium, where there are two alleles in the population for a particular trait, p and q, and the frequency of those alleles, p plus q, should equal 1. Okay, and in a population, allele frequencies will remain the same as long as there is random mating, a large population exists, there is no migration, no mutation, and no natural selection. The Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium then says allele frequencies will change if there is non-random mating, if the population is very small, or there's a high degree of migration, or there's selection. Okay, and so these kind of give us the parameters for evolution. Okay, and small populations tend to change relatively quickly because they're small, and so the gain or loss of one individual can dramatically affect the allele frequency in the population. We see this in populations like Amish, where they're interbreeding between individuals only within this isolated community. The overall population at one point was down to only 400 individuals. It's higher now, but they still don't do much uh, breeding with people outside their local group. We see these are called genetic bottlenecks. Um, you also get random changes in these small populations referred to as genetic drift. And so this kind of shows um, these illustrations here show that, okay, this may happen at different times. If you have a small number of individuals migrate to a new area and start a new population, that's uh, kind of a founder effect. Otherwise, sometimes just random changes. If there's a rare allele and something happens where an individual dies for unknown reasons or just maybe chooses a breeding partner that's infertile, suddenly that allele just disappears. We can also talk about selection in different ways. Sometimes selection is stabilizing in that individuals are selected for um, an average phenotype and extreme phenotypes are selected against. This stabilizing selection tends to stabilize um, something like beak size, that individuals with really large beaks or really small beaks aren't favored, and so the average doesn't change much over time. Sometimes, though, we see directional selection, where one extreme is favored over the average, and so those individuals are more likely to survive. And so this shows that this lower graph shows that. And as a result of this, the population average phenotype of the population changes pretty rapidly. Sometimes, though, both extremes might be selected for and the average selected against. This is called disruptive selection, and it favors two extremes over the average. Okay, and if this continues, it might be that something happens where um, uh, these two groups might become different over time. Okay, so we see a lot of examples of selections in different places. One of them I think I've mentioned before is malaria. Shows evidence of evolution in humans. This is the life cycle in mosquitoes and people of malaria. Malaria is a disease that's transmitted through the bite of an infected mosquito. Once a person is infected, the parasite infects the blood cells and destroys the blood cells of a person and then can infect new mosquitoes. So these red blood cells are needed for transport of oxygen. So this produces a relatively severe illness, relapsing fever and anemia. The damaged red blood cells can damage organs, and it's really difficult to avoid this because it's transmitted by mosquitoes. Okay, the effect of malaria on the human populations is dramatic. It is a leading cause of death in many places, including like Central Africa. Um, and in Central Africa, there's also a genetic disease called sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a genetic disease that causes red blood cells to become sickle shaped and not last as long. And it's fatal if a person has two alleles for it. But if you're heterozygous for the sickle cell allele, it's not as bad. And heterozygous do not suffer much from anemia, and they are much less susceptible to malaria. And so the prevalence of the allele is nearly 40% or 20% in the most affected areas because heterozygous have such a huge advantage. Even though their children, they have a risk, 1 in 4 risk of their children having the anemia, they have a much lower risk of dying of malaria. Okay. And so fitness is sometimes hard to describe. And so fitness is how many fertile offspring you leave in the next generation. It's a relative measure. It doesn't mean you're bigger or stronger or smarter. It means somehow your alleles lead to more offspring and a greater contribution to the next generation. So I often show this slide and laugh at this guy up here who has spent all his time taking steroids and lifting weights, and the drugs that he's taken may reduce his fertility. So his genetic fitness, is actually lower than a person who, uh, you know, doesn't lift weights but spends his time taking care of his kids and raising kids. So we see lots of evidence in humans of variations that show that there's been evolution in the past. Um, and malaria is a big example of that. that there's all sorts of conditions that are genetically negative but produce a heterozygote advantage and have high fitness because they provide resistance to malaria. Okay, so we'll talk more about evolution next week. There'll be a new Moodle quiz open soon, so take a look.